Hello and welcome to our second lesson of Chapter 2 of Ethics on the moral philosophy of Kant. This is going to cover pages 46 through 61. Let me double check if that's the right page number. Yeah, 46 through 51 of your textbook. Okay, so our learning objectives for this lesson will be to summarize Kant's theory of morality, define the formula of the universal law and the formula of the end in itself, and compare and contrast Kant with what you know about Aristotle's moral theory of virtue and Jesus's moral theory we know from sacred scripture and tradition. Okay, so Immanuel Kant is going to develop his ethical theory during the Enlightenment. So he was born in 1724 and died in 1804. And just like many other thinkers of the Enlightenment, he was highly influenced by the primacy of reason. So to say he's secular is a little misleading because he was a devout Christian himself, but he thought that through reason alone, one could come to understand morality and have a certainty of like right and wrong. So in looking at Aristotle's theory of ethics being based in virtue and telos, ultimately the goal of human life is happiness. Kant was not convinced by this argument, and he makes a couple arguments against it. So first of all, he says, is happiness always a good in itself? And Kant would argue, no, that it's not. What if happiness is gained by evil means? So an example of that might be Osama bin Laden. After the attack on the United States on 9/11, they published videos showing his absolute delight. He was delighted by his attack on 9/11. So obviously he was, had gained his happiness through ill-begotten means. Now, of course, Aristotle would say that had a disordered understanding of happiness, that he was really practicing vice and not virtue. But even in understanding virtue, Kant would ask, is virtue itself always good? And he would argue, not necessarily. What if you have courage, but you're a bad person? He would say, if you have someone who, again, using the example of a terrorist, the braver and more courageous a terrorist is, doesn't that actually make him more dangerous? So Kant said that ultimately that happiness cannot be the anchor of morality. He said there must be something else that grounds morality besides happiness. And so Kant, in looking at Aristotle's ethic, he thought that God gave us reason not to lead us to happiness, as Aristotle would say. Kant would have argued that perhaps overthinking it is exactly what can kind of make people unhappy. And so for his ground of reason, he said that ultimately it is the goodwill that is the source of all goodness. And this comes from basically following your moral duty. So rather than being rooted in DUTY, rather than being rooted in telos or happiness, he's going to argue that morality is anchored in rules. So let's take a little bit more look at that. So Kant is going to argue for the primacy of the will. And so in the example I gave you earlier with the virtue of courage, what Kant would argue is it's not about the habit of the virtue, it's about the intent. So it doesn't matter if you have the virtue of courage, if you have ill intent, a bad will to use it poorly. And so he said that the ultimate good was the moral law, and this is called the law or duty is Dion. So we call Kant's form of ethics deontological ethics. So it's based on duty to the moral law. And so what Kant thought was most important wasn't virtue and building character. He thought the most important thing was duty to the law itself. And so the example they give in your book is when we sing that Christmas song, Be Good for Goodness Sake. The idea is to be good for goodness sake, that following the law is the end in itself. And so what he said was, it's not, you don't follow the law because and this is why it doesn't necessarily have to be religious. So he wouldn't have seen like the 10 Commandments as like the moral law. Those are more like guidelines, practical guidelines to live the moral law. He also would have said that, you don't do the moral law because you're expecting a reward like heaven or you're afraid of a punishment like hell. You do the moral law because it's good in and of itself. And what Kant also argued was that every rational being has free will, and everyone is equally capable of doing her duty for duty's sake. So Aristotle argued that people can form these good habits. And even if you had passions and desires or appetites, that you could overcome those through habit. Kant saw things a little bit differently. He said that it comes down to the will and not the consequences of actions, because he said, look, what if you have Susie, and Susie is a naturally antisocial person, and she just happens to be really grumpy. Should she be blamed for the fact that she isn't highly motivated to help other people? And then what if you then have Lloyd, who is a naturally charismatic person? He loves being around other people, loves to help, and he is going, and it's super easy for him to do good things. Kant said you can't judge by the consequences, because you can't hold people responsible for a temperament they don't choose. So unlike Aristotle, who thought that you could eventually gain virtue through effort, Kant is saying no, what you really have control over is your will, and whether or not you want to do something, whether or not you're doing it for a reward or punishment, that's not what matters. It's that you're doing it because it's the right thing to do. And so he also, and again, as we note here, it's not the consequences that make an action good. The will is the only thing that is good, and it can be used for good or evil. So acts must be done for a good will alone. And they also, again, have to be purely good without any desire for good consequences, even making you feel good. So if you go to the soup kitchen and you do it because it makes you feel good, Kant would say then that what you did wasn't morally correct, because you are You're doing it for a reason other than the goodwill alone. So yeah, it's kind of an odd way to understand morality. Let's look at some examples that I made. Let's take a look at some examples, and I think it'll become a little bit more clear, because one thing about Kant is it is a little bit hard to understand abstractly. So let's take a look at some examples to kind of flush this out. So I made a little video, and let's take a look at two examples. All right, so the video doesn't have sound. I guess I'll just do a voiceover. But here's two examples we're going to look at to see what Kant is talking about. So let's look at two moral dilemmas. Hello, this is Lloyd. And this is Nancy. She works with Lloyd. Lloyd likes her, and she likes Lloyd. There's just one thing. This is not his wife. This is Lloyd's wife, Susie. Susie is nagging suspicions and threatens him with divorce. Lloyd is torn. Do I follow my heart and cheat with Nancy? Do I stay with Susie because of duty to the moral law? Or do I stay because I'm afraid of my wife and legal bills? So, in this case, what Lloyd chooses, the quality of the moral act, again, is going to be determined based on duty to the moral law. So, for example A, do I follow my heart and cheat with Nancy? Well, Kant would say that you shouldn't be driven by your emotions. You should be driven by reason and by a good will. So, and most of us would say, even if your wife isn't, nice to you, you shouldn't cheat on her. Option B, do I stay with Susie because of my duty to the moral law? Ultimately, again, that would be a tough choice. Or do I stay because I'm afraid of my wife and my legal bills? So if he does choose to stay, most of us would say that staying just because you're afraid of your wife and your legal bills isn't morally praiseworthy. Kant would again say the reason why he stays is because the moral law says to stay. You do your duty to the moral law. And this kind of makes sense to a certain extent. Now let's look at another example, and this is going to show where Kant's view of morality gets a little stringent. So now let's look at a second example. What would Kant say is the right choice? Again, it would be staying true to your moral duty. Meet Sylvia. She likes Emmanuel, and she lets him know it. But Emmanuel loves his wife Salam, and his deep feelings make him stay faithful to the law. Who would Kant say is acting morally? Emmanuel, who stays faithful because he loves his wife, or Lloyd, who stays faithful because of duty to the moral law. Now, for most of us, in looking at those two examples, just based on kind of our natural instincts, we wouldn't, most of us, in looking at those examples, Lloyd, he only stays with his wife because of the law, his duty to the law, not out of love or anything like that. Most of us wouldn't think that's praiseworthy. But in Kant's moral system, the law, again, is primary, that you have to follow the moral law. And so for Kant, that would have been the morally praiseworthy thing to do. Whereas the other guy, Emmanuel, he stays with his wife because he's motivated by emotion. And so he's not motivated by duty to the law. And Kant would say, because of that, he does not have, the goodwill, because there's a qualification to his will that's contingent upon emotion. And so, as it says in the book on page 52, right at the top, it gives basically these two examples I put in the video. The author writes, here then one can see the stringency of Kant's demands. One must have the purest intentions wholly free from the influence of any emotion in order to truly be good. And so obviously this begs some questions. Can any human action be totally free from a sense of emotion or what you're going to get out of it? So when you go to the soup kitchen and you feed people, are you going there just because it's your duty to help your neighbor? Or are you going there because you also feel good doing it? Do you like the feeling of being needed? Do you need service hours for school? Kant would say if any of those things are motivating your action, then you're not operating from the right motives. It's not truly good. And so we've been talking about this duty to the moral law. So, and we still haven't really talked about what exactly that is. So let's take a look at what he means by the moral law. All right, so when Kant is talking about the moral law, like I said earlier, he's not really talking about like the Ten Commandments. He would have said those are kind of general. It's much more general. Much more general than the Ten Commandments. And actually, the categorical imperative that he suggests is more like a test for a proposed action, rather than a guideline to do something or not do something. So the categorical imperative, I mean, technically there's just the one, but it can be formulated in 4 different ways. We're just going to look at 2. So what Kant said is, first, there is the formula of the universal law. And so the formula of the universal law means that any action you propose to do must act according to the maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So this means that it has to be something that you can both conceive that everyone can do, conceive a world in which everyone would do what you're proposing, and also you would also will that everyone would do what you're proposing. So what that would look like, for example, is if you take a look in your book on page 54, is the example Kant gives himself. He writes, in this example, a man in need finds himself forced to borrow money. He knows well that he won't repay it, but he sees also that he will not get a loan unless he firmly promises to repay it within a fixed time. He wants to make such a promise, but he still has conscience enough to ask himself whether it is permissible to, and contrary to duty, to get out of his difficulty in this way. Suppose, however, he decides to do so. So according to Kant, we have to ask about his reason for what he's doing. So if the man reasons, if I'm in need of a loan, but I know I can't pay it back, is it permissible for me to make a false promise to secure a loan? So you have to imagine, can this be made into a universal law? And Kant argues that it would be impossible to even conceive of this, because if you lived in a world where there was a universal law that anybody who's in need of a loan and can't pay it back can promise the loan, get promised the loan anyway, it wouldn't work, because the practice of loaning presupposes that you're going to get paid back. So if you lived in a world where the rule was that you would get loans that you knew you couldn't pay back, it would be impossible. No one would give loans. So Kant would argue in this case, you can't even conceive of this as a universal law. Now, the second example they give is, and Kant gives, is what about a situation where a man does well for himself, and he has everything he needs, but when he sees people struggling, he doesn't do anything to help them. So we can surely imagine a world in which people who have money are stingy and don't help anybody. That's conceivable. But Kant asks, is that something you would will? Would you will for everyone in your society to be stingy and not help? And Kant would argue, no, nobody would want that, because that would mean that when you needed help, no one would help you. So the categorical imperative of the formula of the universal law asks us to, when we're going to do an action, to say to myself, what if everyone cheated? What if everyone lied? So if you lived in a world where everyone cheated, that would mean that if I cheated on all my tests in college, well, maybe I'm teaching you stuff I don't even understand. Would you like to live in a world where your doctor cheated his way through med school and now he's going to do surgery on you? None of us would will that. So that's the test. If it's something you wouldn't will as a law for everybody that everybody could do, then you shouldn't do it yourself. So that's why the categorical imperatives act more like a check or a test than an actual commandment like the Ten Commandments. And we can kind of compare this to the golden rule a bit, because the whole point of the golden rule is don't be doing things that you wouldn't have done to you. And Jesus himself says in the Sermon on the Mount, remember we read last chapter, he says, you hypocrite, how come you're talking about the speck in your brother's eye when you have a log in your eye? So the formula of the universal law is also about not making exceptions for yourself. So not saying, well, normally people shouldn't cheat on their wife, but what if Lloyd was to say, but my wife Susie was such a nag and so terrible, normally people shouldn't do it, but in my case, it's okay. What Kant is trying to get us to see here is no, it's not. Now, the second categorical imperative is the formula of an end in itself. This is a little bit easier to understand. So we have a quote here from Kant: act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person, that's kind of important, or in the person of any other, never simply as a means but as at the same time an end. So what Kant is saying here is people are creatures. This should be creatures, not creates. Creatures with reason and will, and should be treated as ends in themselves. So again, you can see the primacy of reason from the Enlightenment philosophers. So because we're endowed with the special gift of reason and also of free will, that gives us what we as Christians would call our dignity. And we shouldn't treat people as objects. And notice what Kant says, whether in your own person or another person. So one of the reasons why some students are surprised that we have moral teachings against activities like masturbation. A lot of students say, well, what's the big deal? You're not hurting anybody. Well, Kant kind of shows us what the big deal is here. One of the reasons why masturbation is wrong is because you're using your own self as a means to an end. You're using yourself as an object for mere sexual pleasure. So that's one of the problems. Also, it violates the nature of sex, which is procreation, and it's meant to bring two people together, not to be used again just as an end in of itself. But we could kind of see Kant hinting on that idea there. And so to use people as a means to an end is a violation of their will. And so this is why Kant says it's wrong. So he's not going to say that, God gave us reason, God made us different from animals. That's where we get our dignity. He's really into the idea of the will, right? And consent. So for Kant, like, for example, if your boyfriend were to use you just for his own sexual gratification, and he were just kind of stringing you along, he's using you against your will. He's using you for a purpose that he didn't tell you he was going to use you for. You didn't consent to that. And so Kant says this is a violation of your will. Again, we see that the idea of free will and the autonomy of that free will, again, is so important to Kant. Now, we might ask, well, what about a dentist? If I go to a dentist, am I using that person as a means to an end? I'm using them for the end of like dental care. Well, Kant would say no, because they consent to it. So you can consent. Like, for example, like you as students are using me as a means to an end as a teacher. Are you just using me to get this education? Well, no, because I've consented to it. I've agreed to help teach you, give you my services, and I'm getting paid for it. So we kind of have like a social contract going here. So again, I think as Americans, this kind of makes sense. This makes a little bit maybe more sense than the formula of the universal law, because a lot of times in American language and American democracy, the idea of the freedom of consent, and the idea that in America we're governed by our leaders, and we consent to be ruled by our government and a democracy. This makes a lot of sense to us. So this is kind of familiar language. So this is sort of where you could see kind of like a little bit of influence on American views of what's right and wrong. So let's just compare this a bit with Christianity. Okay, so finally, in summary, we're just going to kind of compare and contrast Kant with Christianity. So this is kind of like our pro, and this is sort of our con. So this is where Christians would say we have similar views, whereas on the other side would be where we would diverge from Kant. So the formula of the universal law is something that Jesus might agree with. Jesus is always condemning hypocrisy. And that's really what the universal law also condemns. It's the idea that if you can't say that you would want everyone to be doing what you're doing, then you shouldn't be doing it either. It's just like the example of Jesus with the woman caught in adultery. He's like, hey, he without sin throw the first stone. So in a sense, it's a bit similar to Jesus's teachings, maybe a little bit more stringent in expression. Kant also privileges the human person. While he doesn't say that we get our dignity from that it's inherent because it's endowed in us by our Creator, he says it comes as the result of our reason and will. The idea that he is very firm in not using people as a means to an end is something that we definitely agree with in Christian philosophy. So we would agree that humans have a privileged place. However, we would say it's because God has given us this privilege, not from reason alone. Some of the points of divergence would be Kant places perhaps overemphasis on consent. In the United States today, we often, Americans kind of treat any act as morally permissible as long as two adults consent to it. Now, Kant would not have simplified it that way, but this is definitely something as Christians we would be wary of. For example, prostitution, just because two adults are consenting to the act, doesn't mean that it's morally good, and it doesn't mean that it's something that we want to be made legal or we would say is ethical. Because again, in that transaction, even though the woman is consenting to it, she's still being by virtue of the act is being used as a means to an end. And so we would say that no, even with consent, it still violates human dignity. So another thing we would disagree with is the idea that reason alone is the source of all moral principles. We believe that our understanding of morality in Scripture goes beyond human reason. We are given divine revelation, and we have the deposit of faith in Scripture and sacred tradition to help guide us. We would also kind of argue that human reason has been damaged by original sin. And so that reason alone isn't enough. We need the guidance of Scripture and tradition to help us make the best moral choices. So that's another aspect where we would, disagree with Kant. Another thing your book points out is Kant's system doesn't really prepare a person to virtuously endure suffering and tragedy. It's when someone is sick and someone's facing cancer, and there's times where reason alone doesn't explain everything, where we need faith and we need to rely on God for comfort and strength. So sometimes, bad things happen to good people, and there really isn't a reason for it. And that's where God fills in the gaps of human reason, and we just fall upon him in faith, and we receive his grace. And so we should never underestimate the importance of faith and grace in understanding what goes on in our lives. So another thing they pointed out in your book is he does they also warned that his viewpoint can also lead just to a radical distrust for authority in general. And I think we kind of see this. We can see some of the maybe the influences of Kant and the Enlightenment on maybe Americans. We do tend to distrust authority, and sometimes that's a good thing, but perhaps not such complete and total distrust of authority. So there are, again, some points where we as Christians would say, yeah, we can kind of understand that, but some other things where we would say, well, let's be careful here. So I don't know how coherent this lecture was. Kant is hard to understand, but I hope this was helpful to you, and if you need any extra help, just let me know. Thank you, and I'll see you when I see you. Bye. Oh, right. I forgot there was another slide. So if you watch this lecture because you were absent, this assignment here, um, Classwork 7, Kant, Jesus, and Aristotle walk into the calf. The idea here is to imagine that Kant, Jesus, and Aristotle are sitting in the calf at lunch discussing the ethical dilemma posed on page 61 of your book. It's number 5, which reads, apply the formula of the universal law that you read about in this section to the following scenario. Having landed a job in an area of the country without decent public transportation, Sheila decides to buy a new car. She's immediately attracted to a sport utility vehicle because their spacious interior and safety features. They are so sporty, and she loves the experience of driving so high off the ground. They could fit in an army of her friends, and if she had an accident with another car, she would fare far better than she would have in a smaller car. On the other hand, she knows that SUVs get horrible gas mileage, emit more pollution and environmentally damaging CO2 than smaller cars, block the visibility of other drivers, and are likely to hurt other people in the case of a wreck. After weighing the pros and cons, she decides to buy an SUV. So what you're going to do is you're supposed to apply the formula of the universal law. So that would be kind of from Kant's perspective. What do you think Kant would say um, by applying the universal law? But then you're going to also add Jesus's perspective, which maybe you could get a quote from scripture. Obviously, Jesus didn't teach us anything about SUVs, but going with what you do know about his teachings, what do you think he would say? And then also Aristotle. Again, you've already learned about virtue ethics. So how do you think Aristotle would apply virtue ethics to Sheila's choice? So again, you're going to do, you can either create a skit, a video, or a comic strip that would show how each of these men would respond to the scenario. So if you are absent and you don't get to do this assignment due to absence on the retreat, you are going to just write up a dialogue. So, unless you wanted to make a comic strip or a little video, like the little video I made that you saw in the lecture, I did that for free using a web-based video making software called Powtoon, Powtoon, Powtoon. You make an account and then you can make videos for free. Some of them you have to pay for, but I made that for free and I just uploaded it to my YouTube channel. So if you're absent, you could just write a dialogue, or if you want to do a video or a comic strip instead, you can. But you will be given plenty of time to make that up. But yeah, that's what the rest of us are going to be doing in class. So thank you.